Cool. So this week I thought what I'd do is actually cover a topic which I wanted to for ages, but I just haven't kind of done it. So I'll tell you what it is. It's about blue zones, and some of you may have heard of blue zones, some may not have done. Really, what these are, just get a bit more comfy. They're parts of the world where people seem to live for a very long time, and they seem to see out their last decades in very good health. And when they die relatively quickly. So perhaps over 3 to 6 months. And what I mean by that is if you look at many Western countries, developed countries where people are very wealthy, they tend to die over about 30 years. Now we're all dying all the time, right? In terms of our DNA is replicating all the time, and that's why people get wrinkles, they get a bit older and so on, and that's why there's this huge market for anti-aging, these creams and whatever and all this type of stuff, right? But there are parts of the world where the aging process seems to be a lot slower, and I thought, well, I'll have a look at it. And I did actually, during this sort of lockdown phase, I dragged out the book. I've got a load of, you can see, I've got a load of books behind me, right? And I pulled this out. It's one by Dan Buettner, and I thought, well, I'll just kind of summarise it because a lot of people just won't read this. It's just small print, and people just won't read it, which is kind of a shame because actually it's a really good book. And the kind of conclusion with this, and I think I'll probably close with this as well, there's no kind of magic bullet. There's not like one thing that people are taking, which is very divergent in thinking to what most people do in these developed countries. It's like, hey, take this supplement, it's going to make you super healthy, or hey, cut this out and it's going to make you super healthy and whatever. It's like, no, it doesn't work like that. This is a combination of many things, and I'll kind of go through with it. Just to give you a kind of overview as to where the blue zones actually are. They are Okinawa, which is in Japan. You've got part of Costa Rica. You've got part of Sardinia as well. Italy, of course. You've got, there's an island, I'm sure I remember the whole book, I've read the book over the last couple of days. There's an island of Greece, I think it's called Ikara. And then there's a population, Linda Loma in California, which, and that's an interesting population because it's in the United States, but they are Seventh-day Adventists, which is a certain type of religion. I don't really know very much about it, but anyway. So that's the ones that are studied in this. There are other blue zones as well, and I suppose the opposite of that you could perhaps call red zones. That's not specifically talked about, I just kind of come up with that. So the reverse would be red zones. That's where people tend to be very unhealthy, very overweight, all sorts of things, the reverse of what I'm going to talk about now. So what have you got going on in these particular places? Well, it's interesting. So the first thing is that all these places are quite close to the coast. Okay, so that's the immediate thing. Linda Loma is perhaps a bit further inland, but all relatively close to the coast. So that immediately means, well, people can eat fish. And people often associate fish with a healthy diet, but it's actually not that. There's another reason for it. They're all mountainous regions, and you do tend to find that a lot of mountainous regions are very close to the coast. And when you look at the geography of it, we tend to live near the sea, watercourses, or rivers, certainly, without doubt. And that's because without water, we die. It's very straightforward. So these populations have lived there. And the other thing about mountainous populations is that it means that the populations, they become sort of, so if you've got sort of mounted ridges doing this sort of thing, right, to get from one village to another, you'd have to go up the mountain, down the mountain. It's quite difficult to do. So what happens is people actually end up living in quite small, sort of, how would you describe it? Small villages as such, small towns where everybody knows everybody. Maybe kind of how you grew up, possibly, I don't know. So that's the interesting thing that comes from it. So that leads on to the next part of this, because diet does come into this a lot. But what that means is everybody there will have a sense of purpose, right? They've got a reason to get up each day, and they've got a reason to go to bed each night. And most people don't actually, really. Not maybe some existential thing or very superficial, but a lot of people, they just don't. And this is why you see such high rates of depression in the Western world, because people they don't like what they do. They don't like it. They don't feel they have purpose. They struggle. They say their family is the most important thing to them, but half the time they're on their phones. These sorts of things. They spend more time outdoors on average than we do on our devices, and if you go and pick up your device and look at screen time, that's how much time you want to be spending outside if you want to be living like these people do in the blue zones, because you do. That's the crux of it, you actually do. But seriously, look on your device at the screen time. So here's a kind of radical thought. If your screen time says you're on it for 5 hours a day, go outside for 5 hours a day. I get it, it's not practical for everybody, but this is the reality of it. So that's the other thing as well, is that they're very, very, we are as a species incredibly social. We really are. So that is something which is absolutely key to it. That sort of purpose of maybe taking somebody a meal, or going to visit somebody in the house, or looking after the family. See, these sorts of purpose are not linked to jobs, you see, and that's really important. It's going to become really important as we move forwards into this fourth industrial revolution, as a lot of jobs disappear actually. So that's the thing, and these people have lived like this for tens of thousands of years, and there's lots of interviews actually in the book about this, about some of the stuff. And these people are not saints, by the way. They're not, far from it. You know, they do drink alcohol, not a lot, quite limited, but the type of alcohol they drink tends to be wine, and it's not your wine that you might go and buy at a supermarket here or anything like that. It tends to be wine which is used with the type of grapes which has a lot of tannins and antioxidants and so on. But drinking, it would be equivalent of maybe what you might call a small glass of wine here, 125 mils, maybe once to 3 times a week. Yeah, and that's the same actually in Linda Loma, where actually with their religion says that they don't drink, but they do. So you look at that sort of thing going on as well, but it's more of a social thing. They won't drink on their own. The main thing that they drink, and I've said this so many times before, is water. That's what they drink, water. Or tea, typically herbal teas, fruit teas, green teas, these sorts of things. Coffee, not so much, but a lot of tea. So you're starting to stack these things. So you've got an affable climate for being outside. You've got a relatively mountainous climate, which means that walking is intrinsic to their day, going up and down. I live in an area that's quite flat, so I've got a bike actually, which I get around on, and I do that quite honestly because walking is boring in a relatively urban area. I say relatively urban, what I mean is that wherever I am, I can always see other properties. And being closer to nature has been shown that it makes people happier. It's to do with the colours that we can see, so it's kind of interesting. But I won't dive down that rabbit hole now, but it might be something I'll talk about at some point. So you've got this thing where they're all living by in a climate which is conducive to being outside. Is the UK one? Nah, not really. Let's be frank about it. You know, cold January morning, do you feel like going for a walk? You might do, but you probably wouldn't do it for leisure. The best way to get closest to this actually is to have a dog, because then you're forced to, which is really another thing that's pulled up. In terms of actual diet that they eat, tends to be 5 pillars that are sort of identified in this book, and it's pretty cohesive what I've talked about. And what you're looking at, it's whole grains, based on whole grains, absolutely. So we talk about rice, potatoes, those sorts of things, corn, no two ways about it. Looking at greens as well, so that's all your greens, you know, whatever grows locally. You know, this is all local stuff as well, that's the important thing. And by doing so, again, there's purpose to that. You need to go and get the food, actually do it. But, you know, these could be spinach or kale or chard, you know, or sprouts or cabbages, you know, all these sorts of things, but all the different colours of the rainbow when it comes to veg as well. But greens seem to feature a lot. Tubers, absolutely, so things like sweet potatoes and turnips and other things like that. Sort of these root veg as well. Nuts as well, but not a lot, but more just to survive when it is colder and perhaps food is a bit more scarce. And the big one for this is beans. I didn't know this, right? So in my cupboards, I've got both holly beans, and I think it's adzuki beans, and cannellini beans, and butter beans, and kidney beans, and 5 bean salad mix and stuff like that. So I've probably got 12 different types of beans or something. There's actually 1,800 different types of beans. I have no idea. But beans seem to feature with almost every meal, which is really interesting. And what's interesting about with beans, they're super versatile, and they've got tons of fibre in them. Loads and loads of fibre, very low in fat. And they're incredibly easy to store as well, because they dry, so they're easy. They don't go off. So when you look at it, you've got that feature there. Essentially, it's a plant-based diet. That's what it really is. And again, there's no bias from my side. That's just what these people are eating. Yes, they eat a little bit of fish, absolutely, but you know, it wouldn't be a lot. That's what we're seeing defined as maybe once a week, twice a week, but small portions, not the sort of portions that perhaps you'd buy in the supermarkets in the developed countries, and certainly not what you'd see in the UK. So it's going to be smaller amounts. Dairy was an interesting one as well. Dairy almost is never consumed, and I thought that was quite interesting, because I thought, well, if they've got, you know, sort of cows and sheep and goats and things like that, then maybe they do eat lots of dairy, or they make it into cheese, but actually hardly features at all. It really doesn't. They are more interested in caring for the animals that live there, which is interesting, and for grazing and looking after the land that is there and keeping it kempt, which is actually quite interesting. So they don't do that. So really, when you put these things together, you can start to actually form quite a sensible reason behind this. That you go, shit, yeah, actually it makes a lot of sense. You know, these people are living in this area. They're extremely social. You know, if you were to walk into one of these people's houses, you're not. They wouldn't have devices. You know, they wouldn't be somebody sat on an iPad or anything like that. Yeah, they've got iPads these days and computers and so on, but those things are more, you know, you would use it just for a function, to go and do something. You wouldn't use it for entertainment. Entertainment is talking to each other, having a conversation, two-way conversation, listening, caring for other people. And that's a hugely different shift. Most people now actually use the devices they've got to entertain themselves, not educate themselves. See, there's a huge difference there, and actually a big crossover as well. But anyway, so you've got to think about that. And that's really important, because loneliness as well has been shown, multiple studies, and it varies, but it's between 3 and 10 years off life expectancy. Again, it goes back to an evolutionary thing. So there's all sorts of stuff on there, but the big takeaway from this, when you look at the blue zones, and I probably would encourage you to read this if you've got some time on your hands. Do have a read. Actually, it's actually very, very interesting. And this chap Dan Buettner, who's was tasked to do this by National Geographic, ultimately as a sort of series of, you know, let's look at some important stuff that's going on in the world and what can we do. You know, has put this together really well, actually, and these areas are very interesting. And the interesting thing about it as well, there's a good point in there which I sort of hadn't picked up on before. It's not directly referenced, but I sort of extrapolated it from it. Is it's a lot easier, like for say somebody's overweight or they're on medications or something like that, and they know that they shouldn't really be, but they are. You know, or they kind of just find themselves ordering junk food every time and again, or you know, that one piece of chocolate cake ends up being the whole lot, or whatever, right? Or they find they're drinking too much alcohol, or whatever it is, right? Whatever is unhealthy that they know they shouldn't be doing. It's actually a huge amount easier to change environment than it is to change behaviour. And to kind of give you an example of that, for anybody living in these areas, it's really easy for them to live like that, because, you know, let's say out of the let's say within, you know, 5 square, you know, if you were to draw 5 square miles around where they live, right, there's probably 0 to 5 places that they can go and buy, you know, let's say alcohol, tobacco, you know, junk food, processed food, supermarket, 0 to 5. That's the number. You know, it's very, very low incidence, right? So it's really easy. Now you take most people who live in, let's say the UK, for example, right? Even semi-rural, even rural. Yeah, within a 5-mile radius, there's probably 5 places. In an urban environment, there's probably 100, and people can order it from their devices. So how difficult is that for somebody to change that behaviour than it is compared to just changing an environment? So if there's a takeaway from this, and you're starting to see this now, people are moving out of cities actually, not for this reason, although it will happen and they'll get the same effect. You're seeing that people are moving out of cities now with remote working and so on. What you actually find is that people that live in the rural populations that are hilly, so that they have to they can't really go that far, but they end up having a very close-knit community, so they're never lonely. Those people actually end up living the longest, and that's interesting. And their diet becomes a lot more simple as well. So anyway, I just thought I'd cover that because I thought it was a useful thing. Any questions you've got for the next video I want to do the next video on some precursors to severity when it comes to COVID-19. I think it's quite important. I will go into some talk about vaccinations as well. But if you've got any questions, let me know. We'll cover them. If you don't prefer video, that's fine. I don't mind writing this stuff out as well, but I just kind of find it easy to do. But it's interesting stuff. You know, so yeah, follow what they're doing. Have a look. Do some research into blue zones, and start to think about how you can change your environment. Because actually, it's really simple to do. And if you don't do it, this stuff will catch up with you. I can guarantee that. Start to think about how you want to live out the rest of your life, because all the life that you've lived is already gone. You've only got what's coming forwards. Decide how I want to be. Anyway, appreciate it.